All right, let's get started. So yeah, the title of the webinar today is Getting Personal with Big Data. And as Natalia said, I work at the University of Miami in the Department of Teaching and Learning, their School of Education and Human Development. So here's just a little overview of the plan for today. I'll start by giving some background for my research by describing the growth of storytelling and modeling activities with big data in the public news media. I'll then explain what I mean by getting personal with big data and why, what I think is the significance for data science education. I'll give an overview of my research program, which until now has involved a handful of observational design-based research studies in informal and formal settings, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that is. I'll dive into a couple of those research contexts more deeply, and then finally, I'll conclude with some of the implications and ideas from this work for data science education designs, both in and out of the classroom, and I'll share what's in the pipeline for me in this area of research. So my interest in storytelling and modeling with big data, with open, large-scale socioeconomic data sets, or big data, is motivated by the realization that how we experience and encounter information about the social world is changing. The recent rise in availability of big data and visualization tools has ushered in new ways of reporting and making social, economic, political, and scientific arguments. From cable television newscasters like John King in every election cycle, to TED Talks, to news websites, public conversations in the news media about socioeconomic and scientific issues increasingly involve narratives told about society with big data visualizations. So I believe that storytelling and modeling with big data now constitutes a new cultural activity, and it's also a prevalent form of participation in civic and public discourse. And so it's a timely and rich design space for learning. Designing learning environments that engage both youth and adults in storytelling with socioeconomic or scientific big data and new tools. It's important for more sophisticated, critical, and relevant modeling of socioeconomic and scientific phenomena that previously it was too expensive to do. And it's also important for advancing, I believe, new ways to understand the self in relation to society. So there are countless examples of storytelling and modeling with big data in the public news media nowadays, particularly in the online media. And many of these are data visualizations that depend on the recent availability of open data. And open big data. And so just to give a definition of what I mean, what I'm talking about when I mention big data, I think about big data as kind of large-scale data sets that are too big to be computed manually and in turn require technology for storage and analysis. In industry, the common standard for defining big data is the 3 V's. So that's, is there a high volume of data? That's magnitude. Is there a variety of data? That's heterogeneity. And is it produced / should it or could it be analyzed at a high velocity? So for example, in real time. In particular, the data visualizations used for storytelling and modeling with big data in the public news media that most interest me from a learning design perspective are the ones that are dynamic and interactive. And so I've shared I have a couple links to a few of my favorites that I thought would be fun to explore. Please, if you also have some, you can put those in the chat box. I'm going to open some of these. These are also in the they're also in the slides on the Google Drive. But I thought we would just look at a couple of these together. So, all right. So this one. So these are just kind of examples of the data stories, if you will, that are increasingly in the online news media and available for public consumption that I really enjoy and I think are really fun to play with. So this is a 2 from the New York Times today. This one is the New York Times Census Time Machine. And what it does, you can compare at the county level the demographics of a county, and then there's also a temporal comparison here. It compares the demographics of a county now to either a projection of what the U.S. will look like, or the current demographics of the U.S., or to the past demographics of the U.S. So, for instance, where I am, well, not today, but where I am typically located, Miami-Dade County, it most resembles America in 2060 in terms of the distribution of race in Miami-Dade County and the population. And I find it's it's kind of complicated, right? It's, you have a comparison not only in terms of variables, and a variable like race, but you have covariation too. So you have location you're thinking about. There's also this one they give you median age, allows you to look up. If you want to look up, and then you have the temporal aspect of it as well, which is kind of neat, that you can shift between past and present, or even into future. So I welcome you to open these up and play with them. The second one that I just pulled up is something kind of similar. I'll zoom this one out. So this is also using some demographic data. This is called the best and worst places to grow up, how your areas compare. And here they look at gender and income percentile, and then compare an individual. So it's again by county, and they compare an individual based on their gender and based on the income percentile. They have a projection for what that person would make, and how that in the future, and how that person would fare compared to the national average. So it's essentially talking about mobility, social mobility, depending on your gender and your current income. So, for instance, if you're poor perhaps if you're in poverty and you're female in Miami-Dade County, where I'm located, so it's compared again to an average place. This individual is projected to make 6% more as a young adult than the average person, for talking about the national average. So again, you have multiple variables. It's interactive. You can zoom in. I don't even know what state I just clicked on. Into Colorado, you can zoom wherever, and you're thinking about location. You're thinking about different demographics, etc. The third one I want to show. So please, play with these. The third one I want to show is something, I'll go back to overview, from Esri, called tapestry segmentation. And we came across this a few years back. And it was, and for those of you who may not know, Esri is like the kind of the leading, almost the main player on the market in terms of platforms for creating, creating GIS maps, and using data sets. They really kind of had dominated the market. I think nowadays there's a lot more tools and platforms to use, but for a while it was kind of only them. Anyways, they have what they call tapestry segmentation, and they've created, using census data, they create profiles with essentially little stories. These are kind of typified, or really you could say stereotypified profiles that they then provide. I think they sell them to companies that are interested in. So if we look up a zip code, you explore your neighborhood, you pick a few characteristics, population density and median age, but they have all sorts of things. This is my zip code, and you click on see results. We'll see that it takes a little bit to load, but what it does is it produces the segmentation, so these little stories about different populations. So based on the characteristics. So for instance, there's a population they call golden years, that are active independent seniors who are retired and enjoy travel, sports, eating out, visiting museums, attending concerts, focusing on physical fitness and good health. And there's a couple others, urban chic. Apparently there's no soccer moms in this district, but it's funny. They're funny. And sometimes if you feel like they match your stories, it's comical. But the reason in particular, I'm going to return to, everyone should explore these. They're really interesting. I'm going to return to my PowerPoint. I keep looking to the left because that's where I have my screen. Okay. So the reason I show these, in part because they're fascinating, but something like a sort of tapestry, it's, if we think about the data life cycle and the cycle of data production, collection, manipulation, modeling, analysis, and data usage for decision making, these data visualization and analysis tools, like used for storytelling, both represent opportunities for learning, but they also represent ethical, sociocultural, and structural issues surrounding whom the data is about, how the data is collected and organized into databases, and who gets to decide how it's used, and who gets to decide what stories are being told with the data. And the Esri Tapestry one in particular, I think, brings this point to light with their segmentation profiles. So that's part of the reason I chose that one. This model that I have here is the data life cycle. It was created by a colleague of mine at UM, Athena Hadjiksanofontos, and she's a data scientist at UM Center for Computational Science. And so this data life cycle shows a data analysis process with messy, realistic, large data sets, the kind that I'm interested in, the kind that are used for those visualizations that were put together by the New York Times and Esri. What's interesting or important to note that a majority of the practices involved in the data life cycle come before the point of assessing relationships and visualizing the results. But what I am talking about today is that last part, the activities in this space of assessing relationships of interest and telling the story. One other thing to note about the data lifecycle that's, I think, relevant for our conversation today is that, so the research question here, that's something that is often iteratively refined. And the reason being is typically when you're working with these big, large-scale data sets, you're using existing data sets, as opposed to having a research question and then going on and collecting the data. So I think that's particularly in school designs, that's more often the case when you're working with data. Is you're developing, if you're doing like a scientific inquiry project, you're coming up with a question, generating a research question, then you're going out to collect that data. With messy big data, more often than not, those data have already been collected, and you're working with a data set that exists. Okay, so moving on. So I want to share an example of a classroom activity with storytelling modeling with big data in the public news media. So something that you could do just with these, like the things that I showed you. So in a human geography summer residential course that I was a part of the instructional and research team, was for rising 9th and 10th graders, we asked the youth to find and share stories told with big data in the online news media that they felt personally connected to. That was the prompt. They had about, it was maybe 45 minutes to an hour to do so. And I want to share the video when the student's presenting what he found. It was an article and data story from the New York Times as well, on the Syrian war. So I'm gonna pull that up, and let's see. Time player. There we go. And hopefully y'all be able to hear the sound. So Natalia, give me a thumbs up if everything's working correctly.
Okay, so the city's Palmyra, like ISIS recently captured it like last month, I think, like May 21st. Like ISIS took it over, and like there are ancient ruins in that town, and they're afraid of ISIS destroying the ruins. Also, that's one of the things that's happening in Syria right now. There's also this map that shows the lights in Syria. This is like kind of sort of early in the war right here. Like see all the lights, but now fast forward 2 years, there are not many lights. And that's the fact because people have been fleeing Syria or they're being taken over. But this, see, it says nearly half of Syria's residents have been forced to flee their homes. Lights. And the country has been torn apart, and this is like the chart showing like what area controls what. These are the Kurdish forces, ISIS, other rebel groups, and pro-government forces. Like a lot of Syrians are displaced because they're having to flee their homes and they're having to go somewhere else. Wars displaced 7.6 million people in Syria and pushed 3.9 million more, half of them children, to seek refuge in other countries. Like their lives are being changed because of this war. Like they're having to flee their homes, like all the things they're familiar with, and having to go into something they don't know about, or and something pretty big that's been happening for the past few years, and it kind of affects me and my family because my family was born in Syria, and that's where like the war is happening. Like this war's kind of coming like, crashing down on my parents because like Syria was their home when they were growing up. Like a few months ago, my mom told me about there's a bomb drop near my grandparents' house, but they weren't there. That made my mom really upset because that's just where she lived for like so long. Like most of my family, I think they're okay. My mom's sister lives in Damascus, and like some of the things are happening. Like sometimes like the power go off for like an hour, a few hours. The power goes off for days, and like sometimes they don't have water. It's not safe to go in the street because like sometimes they're just like bodies in the street. Like most of my dad's, like for the most part, my family's safe. Like my dad's family, they live like up in the mountains where not much of the war happens up there. But, like down in like Damascus, where my mom's sister lives, and like my grandparents too. There's some pretty bad things happening there, and it's really sad because I've been to Syria before. I've mostly been to Damascus, and it's really a beautiful place. Like at night, when I did like where my family had been, there's a picture of the lights in Syria. Like it's really beautiful. I haven't been to Syria for the last 5 years, and it's really war torn, and I haven't really seen many of my cousins either. Like I saw my grandparents like 1 or 2 years ago, but other than that, I haven't been able to see most of them. So this is something that's it's really big in the news, and it's really kind of affecting my family as well.
So, okay, let me minimize that. So this was from a few years back, in 2015. But just a little bit more about Tariq's story. So Tariq's free contextualization of satellite photographs, maps of armed forces, and UN statistics within the story of his personal family experiences are powerful. His performed story spans scales of time and space, from his parents' childhood to his home today in the U.S. In turn, his storytelling challenges and collapses the global distances separating the war and refugee crisis in the Middle East and our local and daily routines here in the States. And you know, the contrast in his narrative between the lights that used to light up Damascus during his family trips to the darkness that is captured by the satellites, it reveals a kind of sense making that is deeply personal. Through his story, Tariq, he assembles and reveals an understanding of his identity in the world, and he also alerts his classmates to a far-reaching global conflict that is intimately consequential for him and his family. This video, it also demonstrates, for me, an adolescent learner's initial engagement with maps and models made with big data and the powerful stories that can be told with them. So were Tariq's exploration of the data used to model the war in Syria extended into perhaps a larger project beyond a couple hours in the lab, his meaningful personal interests could support and strengthen critical approaches to the data and the models. So for Tarek, relating his private personal experiences to large-scale state-provided data, so this data collected from Department of Defense satellites, government intelligence, public policy institutes, UN agencies. So relating his private personal experience to that aggregated data can be understood as a promising form of inquiry around data models describing complicated issues of public interest. So these are some images. Yeah. So getting personal with big data. What do I mean by that? Getting personal with big data describes connecting personal experiences to aggregate trends described in the model. And this has really become a design principle for me in terms of thinking about instructional or educational designs. And this is because my research has found that connecting personal experiences to aggregate trends is valuable for learner engagement, for critical evaluation of data, and for learning about important civic, social, scientific, or economic issues. And the kind of learning around these issues that I'm talking about is learning that occurs across scales. So it's learning that is across temporal, spatial, and social scales. So from the local, from my personal experience, my family's experience, my community, to something that's national or at the societal level, to even perhaps an issue that permeates globally or in all humankind. So, any questions so far?
It is very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have any examples where someone has collected personal data and used the personal data to interact with one of these larger data sets? In other words, it sounds like Tariq was using lots of great data, and that was wonderful. But I'm just wondering if there's anything where they've actually collected data and try to either commingle or correlate or something.
No, not in the studies that I'm going to show in terms of personal data, but with one of the tools, it is possible. And I think also CODAT might provide some opportunities for that. Actually, that's at the end, that's something I want to talk about, those possibilities, because I think there is potential in terms of relating kind of one of these larger data sets to data collected. But I'm going to put a placeholder on that because we're going to get to it, and I don't want to forget. But I think, yeah, so in short, the studies I have done, the participants didn't do that, but I think it is possible and it could be very valuable. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, cool. So the overarching object of inquiry for my work is as follows. How do youth and adults learn to engage in the interdisciplinary representational practices that support becoming modelers, storytellers, and consumers of stories told with big data? And this continues to be the question of interest for me. So this is kind of an overview of my research thus far. The work I'm drawing from comes from a design-based research program that I developed with the support of Rogers Hall and the Space Learning and Mobility Lab at Vanderbilt University, where I did my doctoral work. And for those of you who may not be familiar with design-based research, it's a form of research where you are designing innovational education interventions that can be implemented either in formal, so classroom settings, or informal settings. And I work in both. And the nature of the research is iterative. So the idea is that you're going to be trying out these innovations multiple times and studying them. And the goal ultimately is to develop a theory about learning in this new context or with this new innovation that you're studying. So that's kind of the work as I understand it. So, but what we started out doing, and what motivated the design-based research was an observational study of novel forms of modeling with big data and tools that support provocative ways of reporting and making social arguments in the public media. And our study has centered around public presentations by Swedish public health professor Hans Rosling. He passed away last year, but his work is still available through recorded TED Talks and other kinds of performances. And so then the discovery of modeling, these kinds of modeling practices, these STEM modeling practices in the wild, or in the real world, you might say, motivated the experimental teaching that we use in our design-based research. And so our first study was with pre-service secondary mathematics teachers in 2012. This was followed by a second iteration 2 years later with pre-service secondary social studies teachers. And in both of these studies, we invited participants to use Gapminder. It's an open online visualization tool for modeling global and national socioeconomic big data to tell stories about development. And that's where the idea of getting personal with data really emerged and solidified. We then conducted a couple short design experiments housed within a human geography summer residential course that I mentioned for rising 9th and 10th graders. So in addition to finding stories with data in the news media that they felt personally connected to, youth were asked to share their own family mobility histories with data, and then also explore local city neighborhoods using US Census data to support the development of spatial narratives about those communities. And then the most recent design study iteration that I completed was two summers ago, and it was with teenage youth and I guess preteen youth in the public library, and they were asked to create family data storylines about personal family mobility and migration in relation to larger national census trends. And that was in order to further investigate how scaling personal histories to to aggregate data can support powerful forms of storytelling about society. I'm going to go more deeply into each of those. But to start, I have another video for us to fully grasp the nature of the Gapminder tool that we used and how it can be used to tell stories about the world, and also to give another example of getting personal but with big data. I'm going to play a short clip from one of Hans Rosling's TED Talks. So I'll just pull that up over here, and it should be nice and big. And let's see.
Difference on how the health, and behind the health is the educational level, and there's a lot of infrastructure things and general human resources are there. Now we can take away this, and I would like to show you the rate of speed, the rate of change, how fast they've gone. And we go back to 1920, and I want to look at Japan, and I want to look at Sweden and the United States, and I'm going to stage a race here between this sort of yellowish Ford here and the red Toyota down there and the brownish Volvo. And here we go. Here we go. The Toyota has a very bad start down here, you can see, and United States Ford is going off-road then, and the Volvo is doing quite fine. This is the war. The Toyota got off track, and now Toyota is coming on the healthier side of Sweden. Can you see that? And they are taking over Sweden then, are now healthier than Sweden. That's about why I sold the Volvo and bought the Toyota. And now we can see that the rate of change was enormous in Japan. They really catched up. And this change is gradual. We have to look over generations to understand it. And let me show you my own sort of family history. We've made these graphs here, and this is the same thing, money down there and health, and this is my family. This is Sweden, 1830, when my great-great-grandma was born. Sweden was like Sierra Leone today. And this is when great-grandma was born, 1863. And Sweden was like Mozambique. And this is when my grandma was born, 1891. She took care of me as a child. So I'm not talking about statistics now. Now it's oral history in my family. That's when I believe statistics, when it's grandma verified statistics, I think it's the best way of verifying historical statistics. Sweden was like Ghana. It's interesting to see the enormous diversity within sub-Saharan Africa. I told you last year, I'll tell you again. My mother was born in Egypt, and who am I? I'm the Mexican in the family. And my daughter, she was born in Chile, and the granddaughter was born in Singapore, now the healthiest country on this earth. It bypassed Sweden about 2 to 3 years ago with better child survival. But they're very small, you know, they're so close to the hospital, we can never beat them out in these forests.
Okay, stop it there. So two parts to that performance that are really, really interesting to me. So yeah, I just like to point out some of the phenomena that caught our interest in those kinds of performances from Hans. So first, he treats a comparison of countries, economic and social development, just like a car race. And his event casting narrative builds like a subject position with his audiences to think differently about global economic trends over the latter half of the 20th century. Hans is weirdly, and I say that with a particular meaning, Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. He's weirdly personal in his talk. He scales nation states down to the level of personal consumption, his own car purchasing decisions. Then Hans goes on to explain increases in national income and decreased child mortality over matrilineal generations, his own matrilineal generations. He locates himself and his family in the data model. To do so, he shifts between temporal and spatial and social scales in very complicated ways. His alignment of himself and his family, his grandma verified statistics, also rests on an assumption that we can be critical of, that the life circumstances of developing nations are not that different from our own, historically speaking, and all nations want the same conditions of economic and social life as OECD countries like Sweden. Hans, but what's something that really stands out here for us is that Hans positions his matrilineal family members and himself as historical social actors who both comprise and impact the data at a personal scale. So it's these kind of complicated phenomena in this example of storytelling with big data that motivated our experimental teaching and study design. So the Gapminder context. So in the first design study iteration, we worked with undergraduate and graduate secondary math teacher candidates in a math literacies class. And as I mentioned, the second iteration 2 years later, for comparison, was with undergraduate and graduate secondary social studies teacher candidates in a human geography class. Each study was we had 3 3-hour classes in 4 weeks in the middle of a semester. And the intervention consisted of 3 primary tasks. It consisted of the foraging and dissection of STEM arguments from the public media. So meaning like going out and finding them mostly on the online media, assembling models with Gapminder with variables of their choosing, and class performances of the stories with their Gapminder models in front of peers, just kind of like Hans. And you can see the little, Hans often uses a very big pole pointer, and so we also provided, like we had to TARC, one of those, we used, I think, an old pool pole, like for cleaning swimming pools. I think that's what we used. And so for our analysis, what we did, we engaged in a selective case study comparison. We compared Hans Rosling as a case study of professional STEM modeling with big data to 2 student groups, 1 from each class. And all 3 cases served as exemplars for persuasive and complicated storytelling and modeling with modeling practices with big data. We also selected the 2 student cases because they shared a dimension that made them uniquely comparable across settings. So both student groups gave told the same story. They compared Chinese and US economies and carbon dioxide emissions and demonstrated that the story of who produces more of the world's CO2 emissions, it depends how carbon emissions are measured. So either as a rate per person or as yearly country totals. As a rate per person, the US is the bigger producer. In country totals, China becomes the bigger producer. And then each group went a step further, they went on to critique Gapminder CO2 emission measures for not accounting for their and their peers' consumption of imported Chinese goods. And this last part was kind of the kicker. where they were thinking about their own consumption practices and that of their peers, their student peers, and how that affected the data or was not represented in the data. So I have the Gapminder just so you can see the tool. It's changed a little bit since when we did our studies, but it's the same, just I think a little flashier maybe, or cleaner perhaps. And so what you have here is you have the ability to select countries. I have United States and India selected, but they have all just, each bubble represents a nation. There's an x-axis and a y-axis, but the thing about the motion charts or bubble charts, for those who have seen them, time has been removed from the x-axis. So time is independent, and it's down here below. I have it on 1952. And what you can do is you can select different countries, and you can play countries with trails over time, so you can see trends or changes over time, and then make comparisons. And there's a couple other variables that you can play with. The size of the bubble, it can also be a variable. It can be I think it's population right now, but it can be any of the indicators. They have a list of, or if choices like 500 indicators or something like that. So you have your x-axis, y-axis, you have the size of the bubble. You also can change the color to be a different indicator. And then time is separate as well. So this is a tool, and they when they were making this, they made, now it's the Gapminder Foundation, they did strike a deal with Google. And so motion charts, you can with using Google Drive Sheets, they have motion chart as a tool, and you can put your own data into a motion chart. And the data sets that they use here, you can also download. So I believe it would be possible to somehow merge or connect personal data using this, kind of answering Rob's question, using your own personal data related to one of these data sets that they use at a national level, using the motion chart tool in Google Sheets. Google also has a public data directory that the Gapminder Foundation supported, and the motion chart tool, or bubble chart tool, is also available in that, which is another great site. I can share that link as well in terms of exploring open data and also gaining access to the data sets. Okay. So yeah. So our findings from this work. So we did this case study comparison, and what it did is it led to the discovery that getting personal with big data can support what we call counter modeling. And we define counter modeling as when a data model is used to tell a story that reveals or critiques social inequities, state of political actors, or unjust power relations. In counter modeling, also a critical stance towards the data collection process, or processes, measures, qualities, or model attributes can also support a question that drives the creation of an alternative model, which in turn advances a social critique about the world. And we saw that as well, where critique about the measure then pushes participants to make another model using the tool. We also found from this work that getting personal with big data is an avenue for understanding and describing human agency in modeled economic, social, and scientific phenomena. So in performances of storytelling modeling with big data, getting personal with big data characterizes a way of positioning the audiences as part of or contributing to the modeled phenomena, or as positioning the audience as modelers themselves. And what we found is this positioning often entails moral stances towards the issue at hand. So any questions about the Gapminder study or the design of activities that we did for the pre-service teachers? Okay, cool. All right. Question?
Do you have a sense about what the ideal age is of the student in terms of being able to understand I mean, what the implications of what you're talking about are pretty profound. It's really interesting and really quite fun. And kids could have a great experience, but of course, what you're really after is deriving some of these sort of meta conclusions. So I'm just trying to figure out what do you consider to be the target age for this kind of activity?
So this was with undergraduates and graduate students. And then the next series of activities was, we did with, it was open to middle school and high schoolers, but the majority of kids we got were actually in middle school, in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And there was definitely a difference in terms of conversations around data literacy and data literacy understanding. But they were able to use the tools and explore with the tools, no problem. So I think any younger than middle, so for us, the target range is middle school on up. But of course, yeah, the kinds of conversations like in our studies that I've been doing with Yen, for instance, none of the middle school or high school youth have talked about covariation, even though they've been using the same tools, but there hasn't been evidence of them reasoning about covariation. And which I think that's one of the great things about this particular tool, about the motion chart, that it supports that. So that's something we noticed. But there were other things in terms of facility with the tool and like clicking and making selections. They were able to do that pretty quickly. So really adolescents on up. And then as I'll get to in a little, we found some cool things when you, or I guess I'll mention this at the very end. So we did some of our next study, we did some follow-up interviews with youth who participated in our study and their parents together. And we had the tools available for them. And there were some interesting things that came about when you make these kinds of data tools available to the family. You have both youth driving the tools and their parents right next to them. So I would say middle school on up, and the kinds of conversations are going to be around the tool are going to be different, though, or at least that's what we found so far. Okay, and Yen wrote about what are the other design principles that emerge over these iterations. That's a good question. So we have, I think in terms of design principles, something about all these activities is that the tasks have been collaborative. So we've had, even in the case of the next study, which I'm going to describe, where we had individuals work on their own projects, they ended up still working with others, either their siblings or family members. So I think collaboration is a design principle in with these tools. And it's also helpful, this is more of a practical thing, but if you are using these kinds of tools, and this maybe is true also for some of the other platforms like that the Concord Consortium has, we found that if you are assigning this as group work, you want to have one computer screen. If you have multiple computers, and individuals working on multiple computers, that can if the goal is to kind of produce a story, that tends to not be as productive in terms of generating and pursuing models and model alternatives for the participants. Now it's a challenge. So in our next, I'm going to kind of skip to my next slide. In the next iteration that we did, where we had youth create what we were calling family data storylines, we found that each youth really wanted to tell their own story, and so we ended up giving each youth a computer to work on individually. But there is something, I would say, there's something that maybe was lost a little bit when we did that. So you do have like hours of kind of individuals working in silence and not so much talking about the trouble that they're running into. I think these tools are, at least the way we designed our activities, they're very messy. But that's for us, that there's a lot of learning in that, as opposed to maybe, so the Social Explorer tool, which I'm about to introduce, it's been used in other education research contexts, most notably by folks up at University of Illinois, Chicago, like Joshua Rudinsky, Lila Lyons, and Jessica Roberts. And they've used these tools in classrooms, in social studies classrooms, and they also have used versions of the demographic maps in museum settings as well. But they in a lot of the activities, at least the ones that I've read, they've limited the options, in part I think on because it was something requested by the teachers they were working with. They've limited the options in terms of what the students could select. So they didn't have a choice of like hundreds of variables or indicators. They had a selection of 4 or 5 that were pre-selected by the instructional team. And whereas in our activities, we just kind of had the full subscription of the tools as they were, which made for a lot of messiness, and in turn instances of trouble. But there's also a lot of learning in that. And when you have youth working together, or really anyone, or for the young adults, it's the same, working together, when that trouble arises, if there's someone there also to talk with, there's some really rich opportunities for learning there. So, okay. So I'm gonna go a little bit more into detail about this next context that we did. So after the Gapminder work, and also after that we did that residential summer program, so the little activities like that I showed the video from in the beginning. I chose a context that I felt was unambiguously personal for data modeling, and that was the family mobility history, or what we call the family geobiography. So kind of the history of your personal family migration. And so in turn, the design of this iteration explicitly framed the activity of storytelling and modeling around a relation between the individual and the aggregate. And so the study took place in a free summer workshop at a city public library over 3 weeks. So this was an informal setting, and it culminated in a community exhibit that parents attended and was open to the public. The program was sponsored in partnership with the library special collections staff, and we designed it as a pop-up environment that then could be reproduced in other spaces or libraries, other informal spaces, and in schools too, it could work as well. So, and our decision to design in the public library, it was very intentional because at least in the community I was in, and I think this is true nationally, spaces like libraries are, their role is growing in terms of community responses to social change and as places for family and community gathering. So the participants in this study, they were 17 diverse middle and high school youth between the ages of 10 and 16, mostly identifying as multi-generational African American. And out of the teens and tweens, we had 6 pairs of siblings, and that was not an intentional recruitment. It turns out kids are home with their siblings during the summertime. And the participants, they varied their attendance, but they came between 2 and 4 days for 5 hours each day, and we gave them individual laptops that were provided by the library to work on. And so the task was to assemble what we called the family data storylines, and these were stories about family migration with big data using an interactive data visualization tool to explore the relation between migration trends, so the answer to the question of what moves families nationally and globally, so the relation between that and personal experience, which would be the answer to the question of what moved my family. And this involved choosing a side of the family to focus on and selecting a data tool and data set. So either we had Gapminder available for them and Social Explorer, which I'll open up in just a second. And so Social Explorer, I have a little image here of it. It's an interactive online tool as well, data tool, and it uses socioeconomic data like Gapminder. When what's cool about Social Explorer, it can be used for side-by-side temporal and spatial map comparisons at different scales. So go local to all the way to census tract, all the way back up to regional and national. And I mentioned that, yeah, it's been used in some other really great educational research studies by colleagues in the field. So the participants, they refined their family data storylines over their workshop activities, and then they put them together in PowerPoint. And some of those workshop activities that we did, so we did stuff with the participants that were activities that were outside of the computer interface as well. And I think it's worthwhile to note that in terms of thinking about if you were to implement this kind of design again. So we had some activities that we hoped would invite critical perspectives that could lead to stories or models that were grounded in the experiences of people of color and could challenge dominant social ideologies of equality and opportunity. So we led activities like the one pictured here. We have a walking scale timeline, which asks participants to stand in for ancestors in historical time. And the idea was to scaffold reasoning about historical socioeconomic conditions in assembling their data storylines. We also had participants contribute oral histories to the Library City Public Archives about family history, individual experiences, and those became this kind of durable object that participants can then draw on when they were working with the data. And in terms of the data we collected, we video recorded all our activities and had screen recording software of workshop activities. And then I mentioned we did some family follow-up interviews with both teens and their parents and the tools. So go back outside of the PowerPoint one more time. And here, so this is Social Explorer. There's a free and there's a full subscription service. At that time, the library had a trial version of the subscription service, so they had access to all of their data sets. And what's really neat about this particular tool is, I mean, it accesses lots of data sets. It's a nice interface. It's also multivariable, but you can do these side-by-side comparisons where you can focus on one place and compare it to another place over time. This is in the same year. You can change the data so you're looking at the same place over different times, different data sets. They also have another another kind of comparative interface where if you change the data, so I'll just change it to go back to, let's say, 2010 population, total population. If you change it, I don't know, does that one have, this one shaded, this only has dot density. Well, if you found one that perhaps was measured in the same way, you could swipe and you could do a comparison like that. So lots of, and they have some maps that they have pre-made, or there are, again, hundreds of indicators, variables, and data sets for all the census years and American Community Survey years. And then they've continued to expand the data sets that they're using and putting in here. And even though their subscription service, you have to pay to get access to all the indicators, the data they're using is open data. They're using things that are provided by the U.S. Government and the State Department and things like that. So it's a little bit about Social Explorer. But Gapminder was also available, and we had youth who used both, but the majority tended, their final projects were, the final data storylines were using Social Explorer.
Jennifer, there's a question in the text, which comes from Rob. How important is it to include the physical spatial activities like walking, scale timeline, along with contrasting to activities on the computer? Yeah,
that's a great question. I don't know about how important it was, but it was definitely fun for the youth. So in addition to the walking scale timeline, we did a couple four corner, the four corners game, where so what we did, we would ask a question that would be a question like, how many siblings do you have? What we would do, actually, we first asked our participants to think of a family ancestor from maybe a couple generations back, like it could be a parent, but also a grandparent or a great grandparent. We'd say, how many siblings do you think your ancestor had? And then wall one would be like 1, wall 2 would be 2, wall 3 would be 3, and then wall 4 would be 4 or more. And they would go to the respective wall, and then we'd say, how many siblings do you have? And then they would accordingly go to the same wall. And there we were setting up, for instance, a comparison of the changes in family size over time, over historical time, as an indicator of certain social conditions. And we did that, several iterations of that, with different questions that could be linked to socioeconomic indicators. And with the idea, again, of scaffolding this kind of comparative reasoning of social conditions over time with data. And also critical, and to try to support kind of critical perspectives, because there were conversations in those, like we had, one of the questions was, how far do you have to go to find someone who doesn't look like you? Like 1 block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks, 4 blocks. And again, that question was asked for the individual participants, and for them to think about that question for their ancestor that they had in mind. And so kind of related to that, one thing that we found, so I think there were conversations and critical perspectives that emerge in those kinds of activities, these kind of embodied activities, that sometimes did not make it into, tended to not make it into their final data storylines with, in terms of the selections they made and the things that they said about the data. And so I think those activities were important to include, because that was where there was kind of group level conversation and conversation about sensitive topics that at the individual level, so didn't always get carried through to the final product.
Yeah, so as a quick follow-up, what you're after is certain kinds of competencies, really. In other words, being able to, data literacy, how do you exhibit how do you exhibit mastery or competency in data literacy? And it just seems to me that, as you just suggested, sometimes the acting out, the walking around, the picking your wall, the thinking through, the conversations which are resulting from that, even though they're difficult to record or reflect in a graph, are actually the critical moments, the time when people are kind of, realizing and understanding the meaning of the data. So I'm just after how you evaluate the goal of achieving the kind of literacy that you're after.
Yeah. Well, so I think
display competency by using the tool, right?
Right. Well, so I think when you compare, like, to just looking at the final products, I would say, right, those competencies, like, let's say, thinking, reflecting critically on a social issue or an economic issue or a scientific issue, right? Let's say that didn't always appear in the final product. We did, though, see it carried through in conversations with the data tool. So maybe you did have the conversations in this embodied activity, but we also saw it again later reappear in working with the tool, in the assembly process, in the making of the final product. I guess the place that it was kind of absent was just like kind of the finished thing that they were showing to the class or to us, and there's a few conjectures I have about that, in terms of why they weren't in those kind of critical perspectives weren't in the final product, and one, I can share that now. Some of those conjectures include, our research team was majority white. So if you think of so I'm making here a distinction between kind of the process of modeling and analysis and reasoning, and then kind of this thing that you make that then becomes the thing that what you perform or share with others. And they knew that this thing that they were making, this family data storyline, was going to be shown for others. It was going to be available in a public exhibit. So one was, maybe, there could have been the audience that they were sensitive to, or the instructional team. Second was that, in terms of stuff around like inequity, like we didn't have an explicit social justice framework. The task or the prompt in for this was for them to tell the family migration story that they wanted to tell. And that story tended to be one of improvement. It was kind of a logic of improvement where life got better over time for my family. And there was more of a focus on what got better instead of what was the problem that or any disenfranchisement that their family might have experienced, even though that was part of the challenge. And when we did the family, that kind of thing was revealed in conversations and working with the data tools when we had the parents involved, when we did those family interviews. They were just extremely rich conversations and exchanges with the tools there. The other thing, just in terms of conjecture for why these kinds of maybe critical competencies don't always show up maybe in the final product. I think without maybe the explicit social justice framework, that kind of counter modeling it's just not a spontaneous phenomena. And so there could have been missed opportunities for more scaffolding, perhaps. Oh, you should include this in your story. That being said, the youth made the thing they wanted to make and shared the thing that they wanted to share. So we did give them complete agency in that, and that's also pretty powerful. So some other findings, though, I just want to highlight, because I think for us they're important takeaways. So one is that the intergenerational family arrangements were essential to the making of these family data storylines. So even though we did not intentionally recruit siblings, we found that this became a unique opportunity to study family learning. And because siblings, right, typically are separated from each other in the school day. And here we had this setting for learning with siblings together. And what we found is that the geobiographies, these data storylines, they were jointly constructed by siblings and also by parents. Parents were not in the sessions, but youth were reaching out to them with their cell phones, texting them during the day, calling grandma or aunt whoever. Then also there were conversations that were happening when parents came to pick the kids up about the work they were doing. And the same thing, there were things going on in the intervening days and nights in between the program days as well that made it impact. And so getting personal with big data without really any effort of our own became a family endeavor and a distributed achievement. And so that was really kind of a neat finding for us. And what I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say more about that. I think, one thing that happened actually related to the family, sometimes the comparisons that the participants made revealed trends that didn't either align with broader historical stories or even assumptions that the youth had about family decisions. And then this would generate new questions for the youth that they then took to parents or other family members. And so that was just kind of an example of the relationship between kind of data and these family arrangements. Second thing I want to just make sure I cover. Oh yeah. So another kind of, this is really a broad finding, and we're doing work on this now, is that aligning the family to the big data entails data wrangling to make contact with society. So scaling these personal stories to the social aggregate it's very complex. Like what Hans did so smoothly, you know, with the matriline, it's really a complex thing. And so, but the participants, they really did do a great job of creating comparisons that involved the scaling of time, space, and social life. And they did this with practices we call data wrangling. And this is a term that is also used in industry to describe, typically it describes a lot of cleaning of data. But the way that we talk about data wrangling, it refers to the practices that manage multiple data sets and measures in this case, in order to align the family story with the aggregate data. So our participants employed various forms of data wrangling when they encountered choices among hundreds of indicators, missing or spotty data, that was a challenge, income rates at different social scales, or changing data categories over time. That's a big problem with census data, is the data, and really any kind of longitudinal data set, is the data categories change over time, which makes it very difficult for building comparisons. So data wrangling, it's also, we found to be kind of this process of alignment in which an individual's social values and their sense of identity are a big part of it. And we see this in data wrangling. We see evidence of youth getting personal with big data when they try to locate places in the tool that have meaning for them, or populations that they identify with. And so that kind of covers actually, I think, one of my next findings, which I'll get to in a second. So that kind of sums up the family data storylines work. But I just kind of want to pull together some ideas for classroom data science education that we drew from this work, and also built on the Gapminder context that I introduced earlier. So first, getting personal with big data. My research has found that it supports data literacy and consumption of data stories. Instead of looking at personal experience as bias, kind of this really negative thing, personal experience and identity in our cases have become tools for agency and authority to explore the data. That being said, there are opportunities like to intervene and guide youth or young adults or families to help them better facilitate their data literacy. For instance, one persistent challenge that we had was understandings of rates versus counts. This came up again and again, particularly in Social Explorer for youth. But there were a lot of rich conversations with the pre-service teachers around the measures, like the kinds of rates that Gapminder uses, or really that our U.S. State Department and the UN uses in terms of their economic and social indicators. So there are spaces where intervention by instructors, I think, is key. Second, getting personal with big data seems to be the primary way that one enters the world, especially organized big data or a demographic database. And this is found in other data science education studies. So what I'm talking about is when the participants first opened up either Gapminder or Social Explorer, and they started their data wrangling, and they were given a chance to explore. They picked out places that were personally meaningful for them, whether in their own experiences or in their family histories, or they also selected data sets they identified with. So it's really kind of this first move. Getting personal is this first move with these kinds of data sets and tools. I mean, it's like when I opened up the few examples from the New York Times or Tapestry, and I immediately, it invites you to type in your zip code. That it's that type of thing, or it's selecting in Social Explorer, for instance, Gapminder as well. So for me, we saw youth go in, and the first thing they did was they looked for a population like under 16 and female, for a young girl. those kinds of choices and selections. They tend to be kind of the initial thing that our participants have done when they open up these interfaces. And then third, this kind of a broad idea that I want to talk about is that getting personal with big data as a design principle for data science education context, it has the power to broaden access and interest in data science. And I think we saw this particularly with the role of families, and it was kind of unexpected for us. So, but I think what it means is that, using personal context for data modeling, it offers avenues for engagement, for self-interest, and also for passion for youth and adults. So just kind of an idea to move forward with. So some of the things that I'm working on moving forward, or currently in moving forward. So right now, Xian Zhang, who is also on the call today on the webinar, who's a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon. We're working on unpacking data wrangling practices of the youth in the Family Data Storylines project, with both tools in their data wrangling practices in service of building those family data storylines and setting up comparisons. So that's one of the things I think that these two tools in particular support, which I really am interested in, is comparative modeling, and getting the role of getting personal in comparative modeling. I think is really, really fascinating. And the level that we're doing our analysis is at the level of like a human computer interaction. So we want to know what are they doing on the interface, and like what are they clicking, what are those practices of engagement with the interface that constitute data wrangling. So that's what we're working on. And like I said, and it reveals kind of the rich possibilities of these technologies for comparative modeling. I am also in the process of trying to secure some funding with a data science working group at UM to tackle issues of inclusion and diversity in data science careers. So like most of the tech sector, data science fields tend to be comprised of mostly males, who tend to be white, and with socioeconomic privilege. And there are consequences to not having underrepresented minorities in positions of power in the data lifecycle. So think of that model that I showed in the beginning, and that gets then in turn represented in the data. I mean, even in the tools that we're using with youth. And so we're trying to better understand those implications for work in terms of working and learning with big data. And then in addition to that, another thing we're hoping to explore and address is ethical issues in data science. I just read an article about another case of licensing data from the Internet of Things. So there's, and if anyone has one of the thermometers they're like Wi-Fi thermometers that you then, when you take your temperature or your child's temperature, then the data goes to an app so you can track temperature changes over time. And that data, this company who creates the tool has amassed this data, and they've just sold that data, licensed it to Clorox. So and then Clorox, what they've done is places where they see spikes in temperature, at the county level, they are putting out more advertising for their disinfection wipes, to clean things. And there's a lot that I think there's a lot of implications to that. The idea that kind of big data is being collected, even most of it where you're willingly agreeing to when we sign on to things, and others we're not so much aware of. But there's some ethical implications of that I think can be brought down and brought into designs for learning with youth and young adults and families. So a couple more next steps. I am hoping to get another round of design-based research with the family data, with the family migration context, with some high school age youth in the Miami areas, and these will mostly be transnational youth. And it's something I want to do is kind of have a more intentional inclusion of the family in that process. And then lastly, I'm kind of this connected to one of the ideas that I pulled out. I'm interested in exploring other possible personal contexts for data science. I think the human genome represents one of them. There's other kinds of health data that possibly could be used, but I think the idea of modeling with a unambiguously personal context is really productive. So I'm excited to explore other possibilities there. All right, so that's what I have for content today. But now we have some more time for discussion. Yep. Okay. So
great. There were 2 questions in the chat, which I guess I'll go ahead and let you get to.
Okay, cool. So Yen writes, when designing learning environments with data visualizations, how could we add the component of getting personal? So family storytelling is a great angle in the US, but how does it apply to other countries? Or what kind of strategies could we use to unpack getting personal in different learning tasks? That's a good question. So, family migration in general is an international issue. That's not something I think that stays within borders. What else? What are you thinking in terms of the strategies to unpack getting personal? Like, what other kinds of learning tasks did you have in mind?
So actually, what I'm thinking is about, because I came from China, I'm trying to think about like how does this kind of project apply to a context in different country? Because in China, I don't see kids they have any migration or moving history a lot, which I hope that they can have more like getting personal experience with data visualization, but I just cannot think about one. I mean, in China, like we have a long history in terms of one country, and that could be like you can visualize your family ancestor in that kind of task. But I'm not really sure whether that will work or not. I just like trying to think about like how getting personal works in different countries, different contexts. How that works.
So one idea that comes to mind would be something like related to daily transportation. So there's some data visualization tools and data that this could be data that could be collected on the daily round, right? So where we go on a daily basis, or you can even do a tracking on a weekly basis. And then there are several tools and data sets that have kind of amassed that kind of data by region and internationally, in terms of where people go, what are like daily commutes. So mobility data, but it still would be mobility data, but not in terms of migration, but in terms of daily mobility. And I think that's a particularly fascinating area for adolescents and youth who are just starting to become independently mobile. That was something that came into conversation with parents a lot, in terms of when they contrasted their current life experiences with that of their parents or their grandparents, was where they could go or where they couldn't go on their own. Like in a lot of cases, the parents had, they could take their bike and go all around the city or hop on the train and or go over to their friend's home without permission. And for our youth participants, they had much more limited mobility, so that depended on parents' permission and parents kind of driving them places. Mm-hmm. At the same time, in terms of their projected visions of the places they might, so this would be, again, maybe particular to the U.S. context, in terms of their projected vision of like the places they might live, all of the youth had, a lot of them named places like in other states or around the world that they might live one day. And this is compared to their parents, and sort of places where they've traveled tended to be very, very regional or very local in terms of trips and stuff like that. But yeah, daily mobility I think would be one area where you could have a getting personal learning task.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have any other ideas? If you do, you could put it in the chat if you do.
I was thinking of, I don't know what kind of data there is available about pollution, but that would be very personal to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like individual carbon footprints.
Well, no, I was thinking of air quality.
Ah, okay. Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah.
something to do with sources of nutrition, kinds of food, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. I know there's definitely, like, I know for instance, even Gapminder has air quality. I don't know if they have in terms of diet and source of food, but I think I've come across that before. And that, again, yeah, that could be, you could incorporate some of these personal data collection activities if you wanted to in terms of the daily round. Now doing, I mean, you'd get into more sciences if you wanted students to collect air samples and test daily pollution, but that's definitely doable. I know instructors at UM who have done that kind of work with students in high school mostly, but I think it also could work with middle school students, adolescents as well. Yeah, cool. Okay, we have another question. Where do you find these activities fit best in the academic arc? Okay, at the middle school level, entry the whole field, high school level, or undergraduate level? So, I mean, the research says that in terms of supporting entryway into STEM careers, that's perhaps like a goal. That now it's like the best way to get people on that path is to really start in middle school. That being said, I think there's avenues for engagement for youth all the way on up, and we had ended up with quite a range of so we had set it from 6th grade to 12th grade, so we had a big range in terms of activities, and then we had some kids who were a little bit younger, and the oldest participant we had was a junior in high school, and the conversations I think were different, but I don't think they were less valuable with the tweens, right, with the middle school students than with the high school students. In terms of the undergraduate level and the career prep for data scientists, well, so I guess it depends which, on the undergraduate level, it's like, which population are you focusing on? Are you, like, I worked with pre-service teachers, pre-service mathematics and social studies teachers, so disciplinary teachers. But then you're right, there is a population of individuals who are pursuing data science careers, like most likely they're in computer science majors if their institution doesn't yet have a data science undergraduate program, which is kind of like a newer thing. And with those individuals, I think the idea of data communication as a piece, communication and literacy as a piece to their projects would be something new with them. And I also really like the idea of thinking about these activities beyond the academic arc. So I think the inclusion of families brought that to light for us. I think there's opportunities for adults, not just with literacy in the sense of consuming the stories, right? I think why I like the tools that I picked, and also I think this is true for the Concord Consortium tools. They're interactive and they can be used to make models, as opposed to the kind of the static images that or this like a data infographic or something that you just are consuming. I think putting individuals in the authoring position is really, really important, and it's important beyond kind of beyond the middle school through high school and undergraduate careers. It's important for adults as well, and particularly if you have individuals who want to affect community change, I think data has a growing role in serving arguments in the public sector, like made, for instance, city councils, or trying to get funding for different public service projects and stuff like that. Data has an increasing role to play there. So there's need for education too in that space. But yeah.
I'm really sorry I couldn't join until the hour mark, and I'm looking forward to watching the recording. Glad it's recorded. You have on your slide there CodeApp and getting personal with big data. So one of the projects we're working with that's fairly new, it just started in July. It's called Strengthening Data Literacy Across the Curriculum. And it's based on using census microdata from the IPMS group at the Minnesota Population Center, which I guess you know them. And there's a social justice theme to it. So they're going to be working with high school students, and they want students to have an opportunity to apply what they're learning in statistics to social justice issues. And you may have talked about social justice issues in the first part of your talk, but I was wondering what you thought about the opportunities and the potential danger or pitfalls of using social justice in classrooms.
So I think, the activities I did with youth, and also with our pre-service teachers, they didn't have a explicit social justice framework, but we're trying to encourage and invite critical perspectives towards power relations, social inequities. And what we found was that those kind of critiques, they were present in our conversations, and they were present in some of the assembly process of building their family data storylines, and building kind of what were going to be a final product or model that was going to be to be shared with their fellow participants and the general public. But in the actual products, those critical perspectives often faded away. What they were just kind of tangential, but they were brought back into play when there was conversation with parents, other family members about the work. So I think in terms of the work that you're describing, I think if there is room for conversations with either other family members or other stakeholders with the data and data tools present, I think that opens up a space for critical perspectives to be kind of ushered out more openly onto the floor. I also don't know the dynamics of the research, or the representation of the research team and the youth, if there's differences in terms of their socioeconomic or their racial or gender or ethnic makeup, but that could play a part in terms of how willingly youth are, how willing the youth are to take up these kinds of perspectives. And that's something I think to consider as well.
So these modules that are being developed will be used in classrooms. So is it really the ethnic makeup of the researchers or the teachers?
Well, so in that case, it would be the teachers and their students. So if the teachers are like I mean, the majority of U.S. teachers tend to be white and female, and if it's in public schools, the students tend to be of a more diverse makeup. Then that could be a challenge to implementing that kind of framework in the conversations, for sure. Doesn't mean it won't happen. I mean, doesn't mean it won't happen, but it's something to be thoughtful about.
So one of the things I've been thinking about in that regard is that we know from prior research that when a person has a strong opinion about something,
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult for them to pay much credence to the data.
Mm-hmm.
They hold on to their prior opinion. Have
Right.
you had experience with that kind of thing in your work?
Right. So that's the idea, right, of bias, right? So we had I'll say we had both. So we had participants who did want to tell a particular story, and when the data did not support that story, for instance, generally the participants in the Family Day Storylines work, they wanted to tell stories of improvement, that life got better for their family when they moved. And so sometimes the data did not reflect that. So we had some instances where, for instance, we had a youth who was looking at educational attainment as a reason for why her father moved, in terms of could have a better opportunity to go to college. And she was comparing one county to the county where she lives in now. And the educational attainment rates for like individuals around the year where her father moved, in terms of the percent of individuals who go to have some college education or more, it was about the same. It was like exactly the same. So there wasn't a difference. And for her, she was like, well, so then why did my dad move? Yeah. And so she ended up not only having further conversations with her parents, but she started to explore other data indicators, and it led to a more complex picture of the reasons that might have motivated her father to move, and to looking at other kinds of indicators. So she also then looked at a socioeconomic indicator, something related to poverty, because where father lived was a particularly poor area, and where she's living now is a more socioeconomically stable place. So you had things like that where what is kind of counted as bias really was led to, or when you had a contradiction with the data, it led to further discovery and openness.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we did have instances where we had an individual who had the experience so his family had moved from actually Southeast Florida to the community to Tennessee, and he was like, one of the reasons his family had told him they moved was because crime was really bad in where they were in South Florida, and where they're living in Tennessee is a safer place. And the data he was looking for data to confirm that story. And he really didn't stray from that. He didn't go outside of that. And he ended up using data to support it. But the issue he had, so there was a challenge with he showed counts instead of percentages. So it really wasn't a fair comparison. Mm-hmm. That would have been a great space for an instructor to come in and then to have a conversation about rates versus percentages. And what that might have led to was a realization, actually the differences weren't that big. But if you do it by counts, the population of South Florida is tremendous compared to where we were in Tennessee. So it kind of painted an unfair picture there. And that I think that's where I think kind of personal bias came in I don't really see it as negative, but there was maybe some missed learning opportunities. The reason I don't want to say it as negative is like his personal experience is not to be discounted. Like he recounted, for instance, going to visit his grandmother who still lives in South Florida, and there was like a crime scene, like tape around that neighborhood or something like that. And it's experience. This is experience, it's life experience, and it's valid. But that is, I think, there were times when the stories that they wanted to tell, similar to like a very strong opinion, you might say, maybe limited some of the avenues for learning. But I think that's where for your instructors, kind of catching those moments is key in terms of developing kind of the data literacy piece.
You mentioned rates with this particular student.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's a key concept underlying much of this kind of data analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Were there concepts that you found that were commonly misunderstood or needed to be brought to the fore, or
counts and rates, I would say, was a primary one. For like I think that you still have the questions of what is an average. Like a lot of these data sets use means. Some use medians, but for the most part they use means. And I think that it's the understanding of what a mean and median is built on, some statistical knowledge. Although for the younger participants who hadn't yet entered, for the most part hadn't yet done that work, I mean, there does exist. I know, because I know at Vanderbilt, Rich Lair and Leona Chabot did a lot of this work with even younger youth in terms of building understandings around means and medians and modes. But at least the youth we were working with, the younger ones had not yet gotten to that kind of work in their schooling. But they still had a sense of what an average was, like what it was, what is an like the or had a reason around it. Although if you had pressed them for like a definition, I don't think they could have produced one. So I think that those statistical literacy pieces are still there and kind of worthwhile to unpack. For Gapminder, a conversation. So Gapminder is one of the other tools we use, and I don't know if this comes up in CODAP. I don't remember, but the scale. So Gapminder gives you a ability to show things at either a longitudinal or a logarithmic scale, and depending which scale you display it at, the focus or emphasis and how the model looks can be very different. Mm-hmm. And so does your evaluation change over time. Mm-hmm. And so that's something for the undergraduate and graduate students we work with. There was a lot of conversation about that. And we also had, at the same time, we had youth who were they were young adults. We had individuals who used the ability to change axis as a way to change the meaning of the model in their performances. So they would transform the axis and then, say, well, now you see a whole different picture of world economic development or something like that. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think the counts and rates was persistent. Something that we did spend time on and was worthwhile to spend time was kind of comparing similar spatial scales if you're working with kind of any map-based or location-based data. So what does it mean to compare a county versus another county, or versus, instead of doing a county versus a census tract? So making sure you're comparing at the same spatial scale. That's something we did spend time on. And the youth picked up on that. And the way they picked up on that was with the zoom feature in at least in Social Explorer. So they would say, oh, you got to be at the same zoom scale, the same zoom number on each side of the map. Otherwise you're going to have problems in your comparison. But that, I would say, yeah, some of the younger kids, like the younger youth, maybe the 10 and 11-year-olds, there was a lot of support given for that too. But for the students who were maybe 13, 14, they got it. It's like, oh, you got to compare it. They got to be the same. They would say the same size or something like that. So they weren't comparing like something at the nation's, like, well, they weren't comparing a state to a census tract. Like, well, I mean, you could have that kind of comparison. It could be intentional, but for the arguments they were making, in general, the spatial scales needed to be the same for a more accurate comparison. I mean, you could totally do it, compare it. I showed a New York Times data map in the beginning of the presentation that does exactly that, where they take a county measure and they compare it to a national average. But we, in this particular, and I don't think I saw that at all with the family data storyline work. I don't know, Jan, if we've come across that. No, I don't think so. That kind of comparison. I had that once. In the summer I did a summer residential program I described very briefly. We did some of these activities with the rising 9th and 10th graders. And we did have some youth in that project. They were also using Social Explorer to look at, they were building a story about comparing two neighborhoods. This is in Nashville, that were impacted. They were both two neighborhoods that were both impacted by a very big flood that happened quite a few years back. And the recovery rates of these two neighborhoods was dramatically different. And it had to do, of course, with the socioeconomic and racial makeup of the neighborhoods. And they made their argument by doing a comparison across scale, where they compared they looked at a rate of change over time in terms of I think it was an economic indicator, and they showed that like at a national level over time, the economy changed, improved. But for this particular for this particular census tract, you could see that it declined over the same amount of time, and they related it, attributed to the impact of the flood. And so that was a comparison across spatial scales. Mm-hmm. But I think it's maybe more uncommon than common. Yeah. So those are some of the things that, I would, if I was, doing this again, those are the things I would kind of insert some more instructional support on. Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize the questioning, but I do have another question. I love this example of the different spatial scales, the units at different spatial scales. I don't know much about research that may have been done on geographic-oriented data. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't have guessed that would be an issue that you'd have to deal with. Are there other geographic issues like that came up?
So in terms of working with one of these map databases. Yeah. I mean, one issue that we have with working with any of these tools is sometimes, the data is spotty, and how the data is so you have the data they may not have data for every spatial scale for every year. This especially occurs when you go further back in census years. So when you go, we had one youth who was trying to work with census data on household income in the 1960s. And this particular youth, so they didn't have census data at that scale at the census tract level. That was the scale she was looking for in the 1960s, around when the time her family had moved from from a rural, it was even, maybe she was looking in 1950s, I remember. But it was around the time when her family had moved from a rural area of Mississippi to up north. It was migrated up north to, I think, to the Chicago or Illinois area, something like that. Anyway, so they didn't have data for this at the census level. So in this particular county, but the U.S. Census did have data at the household income data at the census level for a neighboring county that was also along the Mississippi River. So she did approximation and really a process of commensuration, and decided to use in her comparison. She compared this other county that she felt was comparable based on its location and the population makeup, that was neighboring to the county where her family had grown up, in her comparison of household income data from back then till today in the place where she lives. So I think that's something that's interesting. So if you decide to impute data, so these are part of the data wrangling practices that Yen and I are looking at. But if you decide to impute data, so use data from from another data set and use it to replace some missing data, if you're doing that with spatial data, there's some factors you have to consider, right? And that includes like the population makeup, the physical geographic makeup. So she was looking for this other county she felt was also comparable, not only because of the demographics, but it was also by the river. And being by the river meant there was a certain kind of economic industry that town would also, that county would also have, like the county where her grandmother had been. So that's something to kind of, so when you get into things like when you're making comparisons, so a lot of this work has been around comparative modeling, and I'm not sure if that's something. I know it's something you can do with CODEP for sure, and I'm not sure if that's a focus of the social justice initiative with data. But when you start doing comparative modeling and you're making decisions about what data to use, if you are working with a spatial demographic database and you decide to do some approximations, then there's some other things to consider, right? If place is one of the things you're using for the basis of your comparison.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Good questions. Bringing out some rich stuff that I didn't include there, but like some cool things that the youth did. I think Rob, in thinking just about back to your question about the academic arc, like when to put these, I think something. Youth should not be underestimated, even with these tools. I mean, they're complicated, and there's definitely perhaps some sophistication they might not get to in terms of their expression of statistical concepts without a lot of instructional support. But they're still able to produce some pretty cool things related to using the data and data tools. And in this case, situated in a personal context.
Well, I find that very exciting, and I think it's really because I think getting kids involved, first of all, has the attribute of exactly what all of your studies have shown, that really the high engagement outside of school, into family, other kinds of implications, maybe even some sort of social justice action. I mean, there may be other kinds of implications of that. I think it also needs to be sort of connected to some of the other competencies, the NGSS and other core competencies. There are places across the curriculum where, if you are literally playing with data, if you are literally understanding correlations, if you can differentiate between mean and median, if you can, all that. That's a very sophisticated set of ideas, which has implications across the curriculum. The question is, how do you make the transference from the excitement, the personal connection, to a story or a history of some kind,
right,
into that curriculum? And I just feel like that's where I think this could be really sort of big magic for especially middle school. I mean, the implications for career are obvious. I mean, that there is no career that's not going to have something to do with understanding data.
Today, it just doesn't exist. Yeah.
And if in fact you got really excited about it, you could become a data scientist, which frankly is kind of, well, now pick your industry. That's the reason why I think it's exciting. But I think in terms of the magic, that sort of talisman or the moment in the academic arc, can you get it going? Can you get a student really thinking as early as 6th or 8th grade about this and the implications and so forth, and therefore pursuing it? Because of course, who knows where they're going to go with it? You're just getting started.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The one thing, last thing I'll say. So when we did the work with pre-service teachers, the level of conversation was very high, and in terms of with both the mathematics teachers and the social studies teachers, and they had the same exact activity that we did, but there was with the pre-service mathematics teachers, and this might be a challenge you could have. I mean, they use the Gapminder tool, and they would be like, well, we're not history people. It's like, and so we're not like seeing the for them to see, even though they were having intense conversations about how a lot of the measures, there was a lot of critique in the math from that class around the measures of the data, and like around logarithmic and linear axes and things like that. Even though they're having these rich mathematical conversations and projections and modeling and stuff like that, there were all these side comments and like, well, like things like, where's the math? Even though they were doing the math. And then with the pre-service social studies teachers, we had there were things like, well, I'm not a math. They would preface everything with, I'm not a math person, and then go on to use the model to make an argument that was as much social as it was math, statistical. So I think, I'm hoping that because now data science has since this was not that long ago, but 5-6 years, data science has grown so much and has become more of has become a term that I think most people are familiar with, and is recognized as this interdisciplinary field that permeates all sectors, right? So there is data science in every industry. Data is being used. So I'm hoping that also will kind of filter down to the secondary level and into the disciplinary silos, right? And start to the interdisciplinary of data science, I hope, will also start to break down kind of the barriers that kind of have been built around disciplines in schools that could prevent the rich implementation of these kinds of tools or these kinds of activities.
So we get yet another chance to try to break down the barriers between subjects.
Yes. Yeah, I hope so.
Here.
Well, we get the chance, but will we be successful this time?
Right. Yeah. So I'm hopeful that we will. Yeah. So.
Great.
Cool.
So Talia, aren't we over time?
We are over time, but very engaging stuff. I couldn't help but let us run over. I hope that's okay, everybody. Thank you for sticking with us. Any other last minute thoughts, Jennifer, just before I wrap this up?
Nope, I have, there's my email information. Please be in touch. I'd love to continue the conversation as well. And the slides are in the Google Drive. Thank you for the great questions from everyone. Really appreciate it. Yep. And yeah, no, I enjoyed being a part of this. So thanks for the invitation to participate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you so much
really
for doing it. I hope that your presentation gets a lot of views as well, because I think you're saying very important things.
Absolutely. There were a number of people, I got a lot of emails, by the way, Jennifer, from people saying, I really wanted to be here today, but please send me a recording. So I'm glad that we got a chance to record that too.
Awesome. And also record all the valuable contributions from the other participants. So I'm glad that made it in there too.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone enjoys their days.
Bye. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up with just a conclusion piece. This is just mostly for the benefit of the recording than anybody. So if you want to stay for this, you can. Otherwise, feel free to sign off. Okay, so I had a terrific time on this webinar. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you everyone for joining us today. If we did not get to your question or you'd like to leave additional questions by Twitter or email after you've viewed this webinar, please feel free to. We will respond to you as soon as we are able. We had a lot of great interaction. I'm grateful to all of you for making such rich discussion happen. We'll send a link to the recorded session shortly. If you enjoyed this webinar and you'd like to attend future data science education webinars, our next webinar series will be posted shortly with our next target date in mid-November. We have a great set of speakers coming up, including Randy Kochever and Bill Talley. You can sign up for future webinars at concord.org/meetup. You can stay connected with us on Twitter at CodeAppDataSci or the hashtag DataSciEd to tweet us any additional questions or resources. We will do our best to respond to you. Please feel free to visit our website, codeapp.concord.org, to connect with us as well. And thank you all very much, and I'll see you next time.
Sounds great. Thanks.